Hello, once again, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of Off to Tube and AP World History Distance Learning. Gosh, Chapter 18 is just too much to do only a couple videos on because there's so much that is going to be transitioning because of industrialization. So I wanted to make this video just to kind of highlight especially really the reactions to a lot of the events that were happening during the Industrial Revolution, the way that some people saw the events, because while there's multiple perspectives and it gets way more complicated, and when you take European history, we'll talk about it, but for AP World History, there's really two views on how on whether or not industrialization was a positive or a negative event, and so we're going to look at that today. But before we begin, I wanted to just contextualize for you today. The modern era, again, is one that is going to be defined by what historians call modernity. That's what the theme of the modern era is. And the place that it's going to come to define modernity is Europe. And it's because of two major events that Europe is going to then define what a modern society is. The first of those events are those Atlantic revolutions that led to, or were supposed to at least lead to, the implementation of Enlightenment values, the things that were supposed to flip European society, and then therefore Latin American and Haitian and U.S. society. They were supposed to flip society on its head and to create a new, more perfect system that would implement all of those values that would make a society where men were born and created equally and would be able to have a say and a voice in how their governments were run. But of course we know that while Europeans still consider themselves very enlightened because of those revolutions, what really made the change was not those Atlantic revolutions, but another revolution, and that is the Industrial Revolution. So the second definition of a modern society is not only one that is enlightened and then applies Enlightenment values, that tries to implement this idea of popular sovereignty, but also one that is economically industrialized. And Europeans are going to see themselves as better than the rest of the world because of those two things: the philosophical progress of Enlightenment in their eyes, and then of course the economic and technological dominance of industrialization. And so when we look at industrialization, you've already looked at how industrialization really did lead to those major shifts that the Atlantic revolutions were supposed to. Governments began to be forced to listen to a larger portion of the population. By 1900, most European places are actually going to have universal male suffrage. Again, I'm sorry, ladies, it wasn't me that was doing that. It is Europeans. But universal male suffrage. We saw the economy going from an agriculturally based for a lot of peasant subsistence level to this booming center of manufacturing where Europeans were collecting raw materials from everywhere else in the world, and they were manufacturing these finished products that people had only dreamed about before. Culturally, you are going to see the creation of a mass society. People are all going to be enjoying the same things. Why can people who live all over Santa Barbara and all over the United States all sit down and enjoy Taylor Swift? Why is she somebody who everybody enjoys? Because I'll tell you what, during the Enlightenment era, the poor people and the peasants were not necessarily just rocking out to Mozart. They were playing their lutes and their lyres to the minstrels from the Middle Ages and singing their bawdy tavern songs, while the high society of Europe was sitting down and listening to operas and listening to concertos and sonatas and all of these wonderful enlightened musical pieces that we see as kind of high society today. Well, during the 19th century, that all changes, where people have this idea of mass consumerism and mass society. And then socially, we are also going to see dramatic shifts as we have, well, one, the growth of a specific class that we're going to get to today in this video, but also the creation of a whole new class. And even in some senses the loss of power of the aristocracy. The aristocracy had to now share power with others. So the industrialization really dramatically shifted the trajectory of Europe, and because of their industrial might, and as we're going to get to in chapters 19 and 20, the trajectory of the entire world. And so this is a very popular image from the 19th century. It's titled Capital and Labor. And this really highlights kind of those two views that you really see for industrialization. And it's really highlighted in the two levels that you see. And let's start with the top level, the level that those who were benefiting from industrialization, those who were part of the aristocracy, those who were part of what I'm going to define to you as the middle class or the bourgeoisie. This is what they were enjoying. They were enjoying a lavish lifestyle filled with, quite frankly, stuff and servants and people and really scary looking lion dogs or whatever that is. But they were filled with people who were at their beck and call, and they got to enjoy all of the benefits of industrial wealth, and eventually, as we talk about imperialism, all the benefits of getting products from across the world. However, it also had, and you can also see that because of the trade and the money that's coming into around the ports back there. But however, we would be remiss if we didn't think about the majority of society. And the majority of society during the Industrial Revolution were part of what's known as the laboring classes. Traditionally, in feudal Europe during the post-classical era and the early modern era, these people were known as peasants. They were farmers, and farmers lived on a subsistence level. But during the Industrial Revolution, as these farmers began to leave their farms and move to cities and then begin to work in classes, working classes, that's funny, they began to work in factories, they became known as the working class. I need you to know that that is a specific term that comes about in the 19th century, and it is the working class. And you can see the impacts that industrialization has on the working class. I mean, in the background, you can see here both women, men, and children are working in these horrid conditions in mines, sometimes miles underground. In fact, you can actually kind of see it in this, which is really nice. But this man is working naked. Why? It was so hot and stuffy down in the mines that mine workers would often work without clothes because they were just perspiring and sweating so much it wasn't even comfortable, which is actually ironically the reason why child labor in mines was banned in England. It wasn't that they were upset that children were working in mines and breathing in coal dust and dying because of this. They were actually concerned that they were working alongside naked women. That was one of the biggest issues for Europeans. To each their own, I guess. But anyway, you can see those horrendous conditions. You can also then see the squalid living conditions actually, let's keep going with the working conditions. You can see people literally being deformed by their work. Ladies and gentlemen, it wasn't the dynamic work of working on a farm where you're building muscles and you're getting cardio. This was monotonous labor, 14 hours a day in the same position. There were government reports that showed that people were coming out looking just like this. Now, this is a caricature, but still, their hair would be falling out. They had yellow skin. Their legs were bowed. Their backs were hunched. They were getting injured from these things. Most people who were working in factories were barely getting enough to live, and you can see that that's exemplified by this woman here who is absolutely horrified by the fact that she might not be producing enough milk to feed her babies. Many families, especially in the poor, were forced to abandon their children, so you see orphanages becoming overrun and overcrowded during this time, and actually orphanage owners who are going to be abusing children and using them for pretty much slave labor as well. And so you see kind of liberty and enlightenment trying to knock at the door, trying to get access to try and help these people, but they're being blocked by others who are keeping them away, others who are working for these individuals who are maybe kind of a lower middle class, who are going to be also benefiting off of the labor of the poor. And so I wanted to take a second and kind of just look at this kind of dichotomous view of the Industrial Revolution and look at who were these people that were kind of discussing these impacts, especially by 1850, as these impacts were not only seen in England but also beginning to be seen all across Europe, anywhere industrialization spread. And ladies and gentlemen, to be honest, the group that is going to be both benefiting the most but also critiquing this society is going to be the middle class, otherwise known as the bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie, which now you understand where the phrase "that's bougie" comes from, because it's somebody who is a member of the bourgeoisie. Now, this is going to be the new elite class that becomes incredibly wealthy because of their connection to industrialization. These are going to be the factory owners. These are going to be the businessmen. These are going to be the individuals who are going to be profiting off of the labor that they are and businesses that they are going to be building. And because of their great wealth and because of their wealth, because of their influence in society, they are going to become the dominant social class. The aristocracy still holds a high place in society, but the class that dominates the 19th century, and then actually, quite frankly, dominates your life, is going to be the middle class. And you can see here, the middle class is impacting a lot of things that we even still see today. The bespoke gentleman who is dressed to the nines in their business attire, in their suit, in their top hat, in their cane, despite the fact that they don't need it, in their fancy Italian leather boots and high heels at that. I mean, the business suit was invented in the 19th century, and it became popularized because of these middle-class businessmen. That was not what the aristocracy owned, and the top hat actually becomes the symbol of industrial might. And of course, you can see the wonderful chops that come out of facial hair that's going to be. So why does Mr. Oftedal wear a suit every day to school? Because that is seen as formal business attire. And where do I get that idea? Well, I get that from the 19th century. I get it from the bourgeoisie. I am the bougie. In addition, the bourgeoisie are going to be promoting this idea of mass culture and mass society, especially as these businesses grow larger and larger. And eventually, as wages start to raise by the end of the 19th century, and in general, living conditions and working conditions will improve. Overall, the standard of living does go up because of the Industrial Revolution. More people are going to have more expendable income. And so things like city parks are going to be a bourgeois society invention to not only go to work and work hard from 9 to 5, but then also to have leisure time, to enjoy your time outside that none of us are getting right now because we're stuck in our homes due to this pandemic. But going for a walk in the park, going for a walk on the beach, that's going to be, and actually going to the seaside and taking a vacation there is something that develops because of the bourgeoisie. You can see even living standards became very popularized because of the bourgeoisie. It became very prominent for those bourgeois elites to, within their city apartments or their city townhomes, to try and fill it with as much stuff that would show their wealth and their opulence as possible. And probably the biggest symbol of a bourgeois family is that of the piano. Many of you play piano and or some sort of instrument. Why? Because you've been taught this value that hard work and dedication and learning an instrument is one way of showing that you are intelligent and dedicated, and you can prove to people these ideals. And so the piano is a bourgeois symbol. Of course, we don't really use wallpaper anymore, but you can see wallpaper, you can see trinkets here. Filling your house with as much gaudy stuff as possible was a very bourgeois thing. Now, of course, if you're going to be keeping a spotless house, one then has to also kind of take that back to home life and life in the family. Ladies and gentlemen, the working class kind of had these middle class values that you read about. And these middle class values are going to be the popular ones of society. Well, part of these middle class values is hard work and dedication. Well, and that's the man's job. The man's job is to go out into the dark and dirty and dangerous world and work hard and be gritty and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. But another part of being part of bourgeois society was being incredibly clean. And there was a common phrase that still gets used sometimes today: cleanliness is godliness. Because a home and a person that was clean, that was neat, that was tidy, that was on time, is somebody that also was very holy and spiritual. That was a way of proving to people that you were a good person. And what's really interesting is this idea of keeping the home neat and clean became the sole and only job of the middle class woman. This is something that's known as the cult of domesticity. Woo-hoo, another fun term, the cult of domesticity. This idea that it is a woman's job to keep a neat and tidy home and to raise the children up to be good and faithful citizens of the state and to be hardworking individuals while the men go out and do all of the dirty and gross. I mean, look, they don't even finish the rest of them in the painting because they're just so dirty from their outside business ventures. And what's really interesting with the cults of domesticity is kind of like cleanliness is godliness is tied together. You also see women playing this idea of a holy figure in the home. It's the woman's job to protect also the spirituality and salvation of the family. And so she is going to be kind of this angelic figure to men, right? When you talk about putting a woman on a pedestal, that's a very bourgeois, middle class idea that these women are these frail creatures that should be protected and seen as these angelic beings that are descending from heaven, gifts from God, glimpses of what the holy afterlife will be. Delicate, frail, to be treasured. And this is something that comes out of the middle of the I keep saying Middle Ages. It comes out of the middle class during the 19th century. And a really good example of that is a common tradition for Christians, which is the Christmas tree. Again, during the Middle Ages and in early modern Europe, you would celebrate all religious holidays like Easter, which is coming, which actually just happened, and Christmas. You would celebrate that at church. The church held all of the public functions in society. Well, during the 19th century, the middle class brought those things in the home. And so a thing like a Christmas tree, celebrating Christmas dinner together around a table as a family, and having these traditions that celebrate holy days at home, well, that became part of this cult of domesticity too. It was the woman's job to kind of create that ambiance. And so the Christmas tree, ironically, filled with actual candles, which is incredibly dangerous. And you can see that if you ever come up to the Solvang tree burn, which is my favorite day of the year. So again, the cult of domesticity, changing even the role of women in society. And probably one of the biggest things that you see the middle class feeling is that they are the most enlightened of society. And in their mind, they actually have Enlightenment philosophy to back it up. During the Enlightenment, there was an individual by the name of Adam Smith. I know, probably the most boring name I'll ever ask you to learn. Adam Smith, who is going to be an Enlightenment philosopher, actually an economist, who is going to develop the idea of capitalism. So, what the heck does capitalism mean? Well, what capitalism is an attempt to use mathematical logic and reason to explain an economy. And according to capitalists, when you start to look at an economy, it's actually where demand meets supply. So I want you to take a second to think about demand and supply. Demand, when people want something, and supply, when a business provides that to meet the demand. Now, something that I find works every single year with my students is the example of, ready for it, silly bands. Ladies and gentlemen, take a trip back to elementary school for just a second and think about silly bands. Because when you were in elementary school, you craved them. You needed them. You spent all of your parents' money on filling your arm with these colorful bands that when you took them off would make individual shapes, and you would trade them, and you would have a little black market on the side because most of the time, silly bands were banned in school. Silly bands were all the rage. Because you, the consumer, demanded them. You told your parents, I need it. And so whenever you went into a store, what was always present? Silly bands. Because adolescents demanded them, businesses supplied them because they knew they would get your parents' money. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a market. But of course, eventually because of your teacher restriction, and then eventually you just kind of grew up and realized that Patagucci and Hydro Flasks and Carhartt beanies were now the new rage, you no longer demanded silly bands. So when you go into a store, you don't really see silly bands there anymore because demand went away. So did supply. And Adam Smith said that an economy works just like that an economy is going to regulate itself. He called it the idea of the invisible hand. An economy or a market will shift and change based off of whatever is needed in society. Because if people need something, if they demand something, then businesses will find a way to supply it and then therefore make money. Capitalists believe that nothing should interfere with this. There should be no government intervention. And the term that I want you to know here, and in fact, I'm actually going to escape this, and I'm going to write it on this slide because you need to know this. The idea that the capitalists believe is known as laissez-faire. Now, you already know laissez-faire because it was a popular song that your parents probably sang for you, and you guessed it. I'm going to actually sing for you right now, just a snippet of it. I don't want to sing all of it, but it goes a little something like, laissez-faire, 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 whispered Uncle Adam, laissez-faire. I'm holding for applause because I'm assuming that you're clapping and that you've just shared this video with your entire family and they are also clapping for me. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Now, for those of you that are cultured, you understand that that's actually a song by the Beatles, and that song is Let It Be. Well, that's essentially what laissez-faire means in French, because the idea of laissez-faire means that that nothing should ever interfere with the economy, and that especially applies to governments. Governments should let the economy be. Do not have any tariffs, have no sorts of regulations on working hours, on minimum wages. There should be no regulation. That's what laissez-faire economics is. But ladies and gentlemen, when we look at laissez-faire economics in the 19th century, we know what it created. And of course, this is a very biased document, but it created this pyramid of a capitalist system that these people are all benefiting from the labor and exploitation of all of these individuals. And you can see these individuals are not only holding up, but it looks like they're starting to get upset. It looks like they're ready to maybe start a revolution. Oh my goodness, there's a red flag here. Because, ladies and gentlemen, while some bourgeoisie were promoting this idea of laissez-faire economics, they were promoting this idea of capitalism, other bourgeoisie were looking at the Industrial Revolution and looking at all of those negatives, and they became very critical. And these are going to be bourgeoisie members known as socialists. Now, when you take AP European history, we will go into each kind of individual socialist philosopher. We'll look at socialism, how it expands and changes over time. But in general, I just want you to know that socialism has a variety of different connotations. And I know even as Bernie Sanders is one of the prominent political players in this next election coming up, socialism continues to be an ideology that is promoted by certain individuals and certain groups of people. And so, but socialism in general looked at the Industrial Revolution and said, hey, this isn't an enlightened society. How is this a progressive? How is this a perfect society? Aren't we forgetting some people? Is this really what is best for the majority of people? Is this truly popular sovereignty at work? Do the people really have a say? And socialist philosophers said, no, absolutely not. And the first group of socialist philosophers were known as utopian socialists. And these utopian socialists, they believed, oh, if we just sit down and think about it, we can create this perfect society. And so they literally started using the scientific knowledge of the day to try and imagine a society that was completely different from the one that they were living in. And I'm not going to go into each of the individual ones, but one story I want to just tell you is the story of Charles Fourier. Poor Charles Fourier, and I believe that's this man right here. Charles Fourier, poor Charles, because Charles came up with this huge plan, and he put in an advertisement in a French newspaper. He said, hey, if you think my ideas are good, I'd love to discuss them with you. Please come and meet me at this cafe. And he sat there sipping his coffee, waiting for people to show up, and, well, nobody bought into his plan. And so utopian socialists were actually pretty unsuccessful in trying to convince others to change the way that they were doing business. Those bourgeois, middle-class individuals who were ardent capitalists looked at socialists as just crazies. And so eventually, because it led to no change, you see radical socialists developing. And that's going to be the individuals that you see here. Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. Now, you know they're radical because nobody who isn't a radical has facial hair like that. I mean, Engels' beard is just jutting out. Look at that mustache. I don't even know how he ate. Right? It must have been crazy. But Friedrich Engels, a radical socialist. And then, of course, the most famous of the radical socialists, Karl Marx. And you can see his absolutely radical, massive beard. And I do want you to remember that because we're going to come back to that as we get into it. So I wanted to go under Marxism and kind of the foundations of an idea known as communism. So ladies and gentlemen, Marxism equals communism. Communism equals Marxism. When you see Marxism, that means communism. When you see communism, it could also be called Marxism. Now that we've gotten that out of the way. Ladies and gentlemen, Marxists are essentially critics of capitalists, and they're going to modify this idea of socialist because they looked at those utopian socialists and said, you're not getting the job done. We have to modify these ideas. So here are some of the modifications of socialism. And the first is that according to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, he always gets left out of it, but according to Karl Marx, the history of the world is cyclical. There's this there's this repeating pattern over and over again in history, and Marx identified it as class warfare. Now you can see Marx, a member of the middle class, of the bourgeoisie. He understood that there was the bourgeoisie, and there's also this other laboring class, this working class. Well, he labored them. That's funny. That's a good pun off it all. He labeled them the proletariat. So whenever you see the proletariat, that equals the working class. And what Marx said is that the history of the world, because he was in this kind of class division society, he said the history of the world is this battle or war between the haves and the have-nots. And I mean, it makes a little bit of sense when Marx is looking at that, because as we look at history, we see there are times where you have the nobility or the aristocracy who owns all of the wealth in society, really lording over and ruling over the majority of people who are eking out a subsistence living on their peasant farms. And Marx said that periodically in history, those have-nots eventually realized, hey, our life is pretty terrible. Why do they have all the stuff and we don't, and we're doing all the work? And they rose up, and then they revolted. So Marx, you have to remember, was a child during the French Revolution. He understood and saw, and he grew up in this world directly after the French Revolution occurred. And so to Marx, he looked at the French Revolution as this haves versus have-nots. The nobility had, and the bourgeoisie, the middle class, those individuals like Robespierre and those upper echelons of the Third Estate did not. And so they rose up and they literally killed the rich. And so Marx believed that this is a cyclical pattern that will repeat itself. And in the 19th century, the haves are now the middle class, and the have-nots are this new working class known as the proletariat. And so Marx believed that the proletariat, the working class, must first identify as a class. They must have this class consciousness. Eventually, they're going to begin to talk to each other in specific organizations about how bad their life is. Hey, how much are you making? Man, we really don't make a lot. How about your wife? How's she doing? Oh, hungry and starving? Yeah, mine too. And eventually they're going to realize that they have numbers on their side. And they're going to rise up and kill the bourgeoisie and take their property and then set up a new society. Because what Marx said is once the proletariat does this, they need to then break the cycle. They need to create a new world out of the ashes of the burning bourgeoisie and the blood of the bourgeoisie. They need to create a new world that is then going to be perfect, and a new world that is going to end this system of class warfare. So they need to start creating this dictatorship of the proletariat. They need to create a classless society where everybody works for the benefit of all. So instead of our, I believe it was Becca, but I can't remember. I think it was Becca who was our kill everybody, enslave everybody, conquer everything, keep going. You need to get rid of that idea. You need to get rid of the idea and instead kind of join together in more of a peaceful, kind, I would say Matthew Vanier way, right? Like, can't we all just hold hands and go down to the beach and just like have a drum circle and go surfing on pink surfboards? Like, can't we just all agree to do that? So Marx believed that they would create this classless society. And the way of doing that is, number one, you have to redistribute all of the wealth of the wealthy land. You have to give everybody access to enough that they need to survive. You need to centralize the economy. All banks, all factories, all of the wealth needs to be put into the hands of those members of this classless society who are going to be working in government positions. That doesn't mean they're better than anybody. It doesn't mean they are going to be controlling anybody. This dictatorship of the proletariat means that it is truly the idea of popular sovereignty. The people will have a say in how their government is run. But the government needs to then poll the people and say, how should we use those resources? And something that's incredibly important is that everybody needs to work. A lot of the criticisms of communism and socialism is that, well, people are going to lose the motivation because everybody is motivated by the desire to make more money. I mean, that's just universal to everybody, isn't it? Maybe, but in order for a communist society to work, everybody has to understand that you need to work for the betterment of all. If you just sit there, you're not only harming yourself, but you're harming your fellow citizens. Now, of course, this is a radical shift for how the world is going to be working. And so, another very important thing is to make sure that everybody is educated. You have to build up a a classless society where everybody understands the basics of how the world works, and you need to make sure that they understand that if we all just continue to grow and learn together, that we can make this perfect and beautiful society. So the foundations of communism and kind of communism. Now, again, this is a very simplistic understanding of communism. This is by no means going into all of the ins and outs. But when you look at communism, it should feel weird to you. Right? You were very comfortable when I started discussing the bourgeoisie, and something I didn't even, well, whatever, it doesn't matter. But discussing the bourgeoisie, because you live in a world where if you work harder, if you practice more, if you just are better, then you get the benefits of that reward, and that's what fuels you, and that's what's supposed to fuel society. This is counter to everything you've been taught since you were a little kid and you joined little AYSO soccer. Because you were told not everybody makes the team. You were told not everybody gets equal playing time. You were told that you have to work harder. You want to be better? You better go to morning practice. You better go to club afterwards. You better then start your homework at 10 p.m. because you got to make sure you get all A's. Right? Communism eliminates all of that. And because it was so radical, it was very scary to a lot of people and continues to be very scary for a lot of people. And one of the reasons why it's incredibly scary is because of this idea of the necessity for revolution to create the society. Again, this perfect classless society, according to Marx, will not exist unless you kill the rich and take all of their property. And so, much like this game of Monopoly that was going on between Sigmund Freud and Friedrich Nietzsche and Karl Marx is dramatically upending this game and saying, revolution! And he's going to create a new game that's going to make sure that everybody wins and nobody has a monopoly. Everybody shares the board equally. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's communists who are going to begin to directly challenge the way that society was, and they're going to use more violent means. They're going to start by organizing trade unions. Karl Marx is actually going to dedicate the rest of his life to trying to create an international trade union where the proletariat can develop this class consciousness. They're going to begin to try and distribute pamphlets. They're going to try to disrupt other political parties and meetings. Communists are going to begin to, according to capitalists, agitate for their ideas politically and to try and spur on this revolution. And hopefully we'll be able to spend at least a little bit of time talking about how Marx's vision eventually kinda comes true when you see the development of the Russian Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union that is going to try and do everything that Marx just said. But that's another time. Ladies and gentlemen, for now, off it all out. I hope you enjoyed this little lecture.